Everybody, and welcome to the Gamification Revolution. I'm your host, Gabe Zickerman. It is an unseasonably warm fall day in New York City, and I'm joined by today's guest, Michael Wu, Chief Scientist from Lithium, joining us from San Francisco. Hi, Michael.
Hi, Gabe. How are you?
Awesome, so good to have you here. Everyone who's joining us live, welcome again. Welcome back if you've been here before. Welcome for the first time if it's your first time. Please remember to log in with one of your social networks. Click one of those buttons, log in, and once you're logged in, you'll be able to ask us questions. You can chat with your fellow viewers in the right-hand or left-hand bar. You'll be able to submit questions for Michael or I to answer, and if you've got a video camera, you can actually click that video camera, and if there's time, we'll bring you on the show and you can get to ask me or Michael your questions about gamification, about engagement, about science, about whatever gets you turned on. But you got to log in first. And for those of you joining us later on the video or audio podcast, obviously you can't ask questions in real time, but you can keep up with us at any time at gamification.co. And I want to let you all know, for those of you that don't, that G Summit, the global tour, coming up starting just in a couple of weeks. We're traveling all around the world. We're going to India, we're going to Singapore, we're going to the UK, to the Netherlands. We've got these great events, hands-on workshops, live Q&A, awesome stuff. Anyone in the world can participate, all the way from whether you're live in one of those cities or you want to join us virtually. It's an awesome time to get certified in gamification. The URL is gsummit.com. Find out all about it, and I hope to see you somewhere around the world this fall 2013. So, Michael, we were talking before we started about science. And you're a scientist, you work at Lithium, you're an expert from a science standpoint in engagement and in gamification. Let me ask you this question. Why don't we know everything there is to know already about human behavior and engagement? Like, why don't we just have an answer yet?
Well, human behavior has been studied for a long time, and I can say that we know a lot about it, but there's also still a lot that we don't have answers to, because it's actually, one difficulty is that it's really difficult to measure all the details and about human behavior, right? I mean, for example, it's actually very hard to measure the mental state of the person when he's actually doing something, right? So actions are easy to measure because there has a consequence in the real world, right? When you take an action, when I push something move, I can measure that. But why did I push that? And you have to do some inference. You have to do some guessing, right, of what's going on in my mind. Am I motivated to do that, or is it because it just right in front of me, or is this someone asked me to push it, or
Well,
something
don't
like
you,
that?
I mean,
So that's I think
yeah,
there.
well, the thing that's interesting to me about that is, and so that's really interesting, the why is the piece that we don't understand. I feel like many people, though, many of the people who first come in to think about engaging design, they think we should already have the answers, and they assume that we would know. I think that to a great extent we'd know more than we already know. What about more specifically the question of motivation and motivational states? This is a big debate in gamification all the time about the balance between
Hmm.
intrinsic and extrinsic rewards and intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, and how these things, how we program or design to maximize outcomes as a result of that. Can you talk about this tension between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation and reward?
Sure, definitely. So I think first I would like to maybe just clarify a little bit about the difference between motivation and reward. I think most people don't understand that. So motivation is what drive a person to do something. Okay, it's what drive a person to perform or carry out a certain behavior. That's motivation. Okay, so it comes before the behavior. Reward is what you get after you have performed the behavior. Okay, so reward is after the behavior. What motivation is what drive you to do the behavior before, right? So now that we understand the distinction between motivation and reward, right? Now let's talk about intrinsic and extrinsic, right? There is intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, and there's also intrinsic and extrinsic rewards as well. So intrinsic motivation, so a lot of people think about intrinsic motivation is a characteristic of the person, right? So I mean, like Gabe, you are very intrinsically motivated about gamification, right? But it's actually not true. Okay, intrinsic motivation or motivation is actually a should be seen with respect to the behavior. Okay, so what that means is that intrinsic motivation, right, means that the behavior is intrinsically motivating to you, right? I mean, I'm intrinsically motivated for certain thing, for certain behavior, but not other, right? I may not be intrinsically motivated to, I don't know, um, spend $1 million or something. I don't have $1 million, but I mean, I may be intrinsically motivated to solve a really difficult problem, uh, but I may not be intrinsically motivated to, I don't know, to do some other things, right? So it's intrinsic motivation is behavior dependent. And so intrinsic motivation means that it's whatever that you do that's just for this love of doing that behavior, right? So anything else, if you do it for whether the reason is good or bad, if it's not intrinsic to the behavior, that's called extrinsic motivation. Okay. So if you do it for, people may want to study because they love to get good grades, and that's a perfectly good reason, right? But that's
Well,
extrinsic
let
motivation
me ask you a
because
question
you
about that.
you study not because you love to
Yeah, so let
study.
me ask you a
Yeah.
question about that.
Hmm.
Let's talk about that subject for 1 second, because so many people then
Sure.
think,
Of course.
many people then ask the question, which I think is the deeper question here, Michael: is that good or bad?
Hmm. That's depending on what you want to achieve, right? I mean, I think it's not good or bad. That's how it is, right? So I think a lot of people are interested in, for example, oops, my screen just logged me
No
out.
worries, we can still
Sorry,
see
I'm
you.
back. Um, no, we have this our corporate computer have a timeout kind of. If you don't do anything, I should keep my mouse moving. I'll make sure I'm aware of that. Okay, so let me get back to the question. So yeah, whether it's good or bad, depending on what you're trying to achieve, right? If you're trying to motivate people for a long term, you want intrinsically motivated people, right? People love to sing because they just love singing, and they will sing for the rest of their life, right? And if you care about short-term kind of engagement, for a specific time, there's actually a spectrum of kind of time scale that you could actually characterize. Um, and different types of, I think, rewards or motivation work at different time scales, right? So the key, so I kind of just make the distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic
Yes.
motivation, right? Intrinsic motivation is because you do something just for the love of doing that, right? I love to study math
Hmm.
because I just love it, right? I love to study math not because um, it could be a perfectly good reason. Like some people love to study math because they feel cool, they feel kind of smart, right? It's perfectly good reason, right? It's not bad or anything, but that's
Right.
extrinsically motivated, right? And so now, okay, reward on the other hand, it has intrinsic and extrinsic as well, but that's totally different than intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Just it happens that people use the same word, intrinsic and extrinsic, to describe that, but it's actually
Right.
completely different, right? Intrinsic rewards are reward that are less tangible, like appreciation of other people, right? Or something like it's like I help people because I love to be appreciated. That's actually an extrinsic motivation and a intrinsic
So
reward.
here's
Okay,
So,
so
so a relevant question to that, which Dutch had asked a little bit earlier in the chat, which is about time scale. So you started talking about time
sure.
scale. Can you tell us more about what you understand about the time scale, the effectiveness of intrinsic or extrinsic motivation, or intrinsic extrinsic reward, either way?
Yeah. So okay. So I mean, so there are lots of different tools in gamification, right? And these tools are, I would say, have a different time scales of feedback. Okay, so for example, like points are essentially immediate feedback. You did something, and you pretty much get feedback immediately. Your points increase right away when you perform the action. And then the next level of kind of, I would say, longer time scale would be probably a badge, right? After you did something, you had to do several times or some, and then you eventually get a badge when you cross some threshold, and then there's some longer time scale things such as leaderboard, right? Not only you kind of get better, and then you kind of have to compare to your peers, and then you kind of have to, you have to do a little bit better than just what you normally do yourself. If you're the top guy, then no problem. But then if you're not, then you have to do a little bit more. You have to spend a little more time to get better at what you're doing, to kind of essentially beat your friends or something like that, right? To get up on the leaderboard, right? And then on the longer time scale, there's actually, I would say, the notion of like a little bit of I would say, medals and trophy, right? These are, I think, people think of them as badges, but I like to think them as different because badges typically you reward people for a single action, and it's really transparent what you have to do to get those badges. And medals and trophies are a little bit different, right? It's if you know think about medals in life, right? I mean, you get a medal not because you just do one thing. It's a lot of actions that you do, you know, and then after even in a longer time scale, there's a kind of reputation, right? It takes a long time to build a reputation, right? So Gabe, you're an expert in gamification. It takes some time to build that reputation, being an evangelist and expert in gamification, right? So these takes a long time to kind of build, right? So it becomes attached to you, right? So the thing to remember is that, depending on how long the effect you want to have, um, the effect, okay, the effect that you want to have should match to the time scale of the feedback. Right. So if you are interested in driving, say, engagement in a conference, right, and the conference lasts like 3 to 5 days, right? Then points is perfectly fine. You give them a bunch of points, and then and then they, at the end of the conference, 3 to 5 days, you could select the winner, and
Right.
that's all good, right? But if you want a longer time scale effect, if you want to, for example, brands like to drive loyalty, and loyalty is inherently I would say, a concept that's of long time scale, right? And that means you can't just use points because after a while people get tired of points, right? That means you may have to do something longer than you may have to
Status kind of
do, I would
mechanics, right?
say,
Right.
progress people kind of up to the point where they actually
So
establish
this
their
is
reputation,
so it's very
and
interesting,
so on and
right?
so
Because this
forth.
is one of the reasons why we often talk about gamification being something like a mix of loyalty and games and behavioral econ, because there's all this kind of stuff. And that was a really great question, Dutch. And actually, the kind of follow-up question from Ivan in the chat was, what about balancing these things? So let's say that we're designing a system that's meant to engage a user and get them to do something, right? Like get them to engage with a brand or engage with a personal behavior change. How do we balance off the two questions of intrinsic and extrinsic? Let's just talk about motivation for a second. How do we balance those two things off in our design?
Okay. Yeah, so I think the balancing off is that like pretty much all the gamification tools out there, the reward is all extrinsic, right? You get a badge. It's something kind of very tangible, right? It's not something like appreciation or something so these are rewards now, okay? Not motivation, right? So remember earlier I said if you do something not because just the love of doing it, that's extrinsic motivation. So all rewards, whether they are intrinsic or extrinsic reward, they are all extrinsic
Okay.
motivation. All rewards, regardless of whether they're intrinsic or extrinsic rewards, they are all extrinsic motivation, right? Okay, so now the key is to basically you want to shift people from extrinsic. So extrinsic reward is easy. You give them a badge, you give them points, get them on leaderboard, right? You want to slowly shift them to the point where they start to realize that there's actually some intrinsic reward, right? Okay, you give people points and badges and for stuff that they do. It's very important to let people know that these actions that you perform actually benefit people, and people appreciate that, right? You kind of slowly shift them to realize, oh, people appreciate me for doing that. That's I would say, a less tangible thing, right? So now that's I would say a more intrinsic type of reward, right? It's not motivation yet, okay? Because it's like it's still reward. You do it for, and it's still an extrinsic motivation because you do it. Okay, for example, I may help someone in a community, because I like to get appreciated, right? And that's perfectly fine. That's not a intrinsic motivation. It's extrinsic motivation because I help people not because I love to help, because I love to get
Right.
appreciated, right? So that's extrinsic motivation, but it's now you're shifting people from care about the points and badges to care about the appreciation, which is actually intrinsic, from extrinsic reward to intrinsic reward, right? Which is still extrinsic motivation, but once they have intrinsic rewards. See the difficult in the language.
Yeah.
Um,
Well,
yes,
yeah.
yeah. Now people could internalize that, and once they start to realize that they have a place, they have a role, right? They start to realize the value that they contribute. Then it becomes an intrinsic motivation. They would just do it because
So
they love
I
doing
think
it,
that's actually
right?
very interesting and a really good high wire act that I think, folks, it's definitely worth re-listening to this segment of the show when you get a chance. We're going to have the recording up right afterwards, as we always do. Re-listen to this segment, walk through it again, understand the relationship between motivation and reward from Michael's perspective, which I think is really interesting. And of course, make sure that you're following us every week. Go to gamification.co and get all the resources that you need to design cool things for gamification. Now, there's a question that came up from Clemens, which kind of shifts gears a little bit, Michael. So I want to put you thinking about a slightly different side of your research and your work, which is about feelings. You briefly mentioned before, people's feelings. So what do we know about people's feelings and about their emotions? And how important is it for us to understand the emotional state of someone, not just their motivational state, but their emotional state when we're designing something for them?
Hmm.
What do we know about that?
Yeah, so emotional states are, I would say, a little bit less well understood because there's actually a very complex neurobiological science behind that. My actually undergraduate, one of my degree is in molecular biology in neuroscience, and it's not a fully understand subject yet, why we have emotion, but I think it certainly affects our motivation, right? If you are in, really sad mood, right, it's just really hard to motivate you, right? The two are linked, but the relationship between the two are not very clearly understood. And it's actually it's great if you can leverage people's emotional state. If people are, but I think a lot of people when they say the emotional state, they actually are actually talking about the motivational state. I mean, they feel that okay, I'm ultimately if I'm excited to do what? I'm excited, if I want to do something, then I'm motivated. Right? So it's kind of emotional states and kind of this, motivational states are sometimes people confound the two, and it's actually very kind of difficult, I would say, to tease apart. And I think that in some way they are in some way they're linked, but then they're not like
But
the
here's
same
the
thing.
question for you, which I think is very interesting, and having seen some new startups that are kind of thinking about the emotional state of the user. Isn't like all of our design here kind of pointless if the user shows up in a really bad mood, right? Doesn't that kind of automatically
Yes.
negate sort of everything we're
Yes.
doing? What can we do? What should we be doing to deal with the idea of the user being in an extreme emotional state that might cloud our ability to get their behavior?
Yeah, so this is where, I think as industry, the gamification industry, we should not only focus on motivating, but also I would say there's a notion of in academia we call it the nudge. Okay, so in terms of the behavioral model, the friend of mine at Stanford, Professor BJ Fogg, is a great kind of experimental psychology who proposed this behavioral model that says basically underlying every single human behavior, there's three factors, right? There's motivation, there's ability, and there's a trigger, right? And people only will carry out the behavior when you have those three things happen at the same time. Okay, when you have motivation and don't have ability or trigger, or when you have all three but they don't happen at the same time, people don't tend to reliably carry out the
Right.
behavior, and they only when you have those three things together, right? So gamification have been, I would say, focused heavily on motivating people by giving people badges and giving people rewards or some incentive, right, to make them want to do something. Okay, but and sometimes there's trigger, right? So but then very few of them actually focus on the ability, right? If you are just in a really bad mood, right, then you don't have the ability to carry out certain action. There's no point, motivating people. You actually annoy people a lot if you're actually trying to motivate them at the time when they're actually in a bad mood, right? So this is the where the trigger, the science of designing a good trigger is to figure out the right time, when the person, and when is the right time, right? You may ask. So the right time is when the person is both motivated and have the ability to carry out the action. That's the right time, right? So that's the time when you should trigger them to or call them to take a
Right.
certain
Although
action.
that sets a very
And that,
Yeah, it sets a
typically.
really high bar, especially if we're designing something kind of
Yes.
for a very big audience, right? Because if we're designing, let's say we're designing an interaction for a big brand who's trying to get people to understand how it works and
Yes.
come back and look at what their new information, all this kind of stuff. I mean, we're talking about maybe a cross section of the
Hmm.
population that's millions of people. So, kind of pivoting towards this question
Yes.
from David. Thanks for the question, David, which is about big data and our understanding of motivation, online engagement.
Mhm.
You know, I know you think about this a lot in your work at Lithium and in your kind of science and research. What are some of the things that you've learned that have been really
Hmm.
counterintuitive, things that have come out from the data that you've seen, either in implementations that Lithium's actually worked on or other places you've seen, that have been things where you've been like, huh, that's not what I was expecting. Tough for a scientist.
Mm. Let's see. I think there are certainly a lot of unexpected things, but not so much with respect to gamification, though. I think my research actually spans a lot of big data. I'm actually recently designing some architecture in the back end for big data. So I think the key is really to, you mentioned about the difficulty of designing these things for large population, right? So the key really is to get the feedback data, right? So in some way, gamification to be effective, there's no one size fits all, right? You kind of have to understand the person, you have to understand the behavior. So understand the behavior, understand the player, and then you basically design, essentially have the system be able to kind of learn about the state the person is in, right? Uh, and then trigger the person at the time when it's appropriate for him, for
So,
that person, right? It may not be for me, maybe one time, for you, maybe a different time.
right.
So, um, so the key is really to get data from both of us, right? To see when is to infer, make that computation, that behavioral inference, to know that okay, now this is the right time to trigger Michael, and and the different time is a good time, the best time to
So here's
trigger
here's a
Gary,
question for
right?
you though. So David points out, thanks for that question, David, by the way. So David points out, he says, okay, this single subject design, designing something that is for a particular person, adaptive to that person. And I think it's a great high bar to set. But Michael, a lot of the most successful examples of behavior change, the ones that are, really effective behavior change, actually have the same system for everybody. Really, like I get that it sounds very aspirational, but like Weight Watchers is not really customized for each particular participant. There is a process, and neither is Nike Plus really. I mean, there's some parameters, but they're not like looking to try to decipher what time of day you like to run and tooled around that time of day. It's just like general kind of process for
Yeah,
driving you. So how do you explain that? What's the delta between that idealized design
yeah.
and
So uh, my
oh, this screen?
screen got locked out
Lithium,
again.
the
Sorry.
screen. While you're getting unlocked from there,
Uh,
just a reminder also for everybody, yeah,
okay.
that
All
if
right.
they want to
Back.
follow you, no, I want to make
Sorry.
sure that everybody has your Twitter handle. We'll just put it up on the screen there. It's Michael Wu, where the 8 replaces the letter A, as Michael's fond of saying. So make sure that you get a chance to follow Michael. So back to you, Michael. The difference between needing this adaptive design and the one size fits all. What's the real answer there?
Yeah. So in some way, right, if you have basically the game design itself, right, it has some I would say adaptivity, built into it, right? The very fact that it takes different people, right, to it takes different time for different people to perform a different set of action, right? So even though okay, the rules are the same. Right. I suppose you get to a certain, you perform 10 of such action, you get a badge, right? But you may take like 5 minutes to perform those 10 action. You may be expert, right, in that, and you get a badge right then, right there, right? But I may not be so good. It may take me a week to perform those 10 action, and I get a badge later on, right? It's not really that that I have to, in some way, right? The design is already taking some data. It's learning that okay, it takes this person you know this much time to achieve that certain criteria, right? So it's actually getting some feedback data from the audience, from you and me and whoever is participating, to get to a certain place, and then feedback to you that okay, now you reach that criteria, you get a badge, right? So that's a very simple mechanism, right? I think there are actually more sophisticated algorithm in, I just want to kind of have a longer term type of, I would say, a longer time scale reinforcement, a longer time scale effect for people.
So what you see,
So that's the
when you
basic
say
difference.
that, so it's interesting because when you say that, what I start thinking about is I start thinking about these gamified online courses like Khan Academy, that where they're really one of the core things that they talk about is about the progression to mastery being highly individualized. So the system is the same, but everyone can progress along that pathway at their own
Hmm.
pace. And the teacher's role is to kind of provide the
That's right.
scaffolding and insight. Do you think there are lessons we can learn from
Yeah.
that you've seen that apply beyond education?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think there's definitely much more that we can do, right? So as I think that at the very basic level, right, that's just what you should do. I mean, because you don't know initially, there's no data about like you or me or anybody, right? So it's the best you can do is to kind of just get them to participate when they reach a certain level, they progress at their own rate, right? But while they are participating, right, you can also get other data, right? So suppose you want to monitor tweets, at a conference, and you want to drive people to tweet about things, and then you say, okay, at the end of the conference, you may give the top tweeter certain
Yeah.
rewards or something. Okay, so initially you could just plan to give, okay, get a badge when you get like 10 tweets, you get something like that, right? But you could do a little more analysis. You could say, okay, now people have tweeted, right? You could collect those tweets about the person and say, oh, okay, this person tweets a lot about, gamification. Gabe tweets a lot about gamification. Michael tweets about gamification, but he also tweets about big data. He also tweets about, behavioral science and behavioral economics. So you can learn a little bit more, right? While you get people to participate and progress at their own rate, right? They generate data, right? And those data can be collected to do a better inference. Maybe now that, okay, I could give Gabe a special badge being a gamification expert, and Michael a special badge on big data expert, right? So now you could kind of start to kind of tailor the type of feedback mechanism. Initially, you could design them to be all the same, but while people are participating, it generates data, and then you collect those feedback data to learn about the person, and then create a different
So
kind of
what
feedback
do people?
mechanism.
So this is the thing, Michael, right? It's like so amazing to talk to you because you're so bright and you're sitting at the intersection of these two really important topics in your research: big data and gamification. Now being seen a lot together, lots of people talking about the intersection of these two things. What do people do when they don't have a Michael Wu on staff? What advice can you give people who are? Listen, I'm being serious. I mean, I could use you every day here in my world. What should people do who have less resources? They can't hire you because you get a full-time gig at Lithium. What do people do who don't have a data scientist on staff? How do they take steps that are concrete to leverage the data that's coming through their engagement system and turn that into something meaningful?
Yeah, I think the key is not really about getting a data scientist, is just be data savvy, right? I mean, just because you cannot analyze petabytes of data doesn't mean you cannot collect any data, right? I think, okay, if you cannot collect all the tweets about me, right, why don't you just collect the last 10 tweets? Yeah, I'm sure you can learn something about me, right? So this is the notion of a baby step, right? I think if you start with the baby step, you can learn and iterate and get better and learn much more about your customers and your consumers and your participants or whatever you're
So
interested
which
to
data
engage.
set would you have people focus on first? What should they be looking at the qualitative like output, like in your suggestion, which was making me laugh because we built this gamified conference app called LiveCube that's been quite popular that we built that uses some of those ideas. But would
Mhm.
you suggest that the first place that they look to gather this big data, is it about the content of what people are saying, or is it really about action, or is it about their social graph? Where should they start? What's most important to layer on top here?
Yeah, it depends on what you want to achieve, right? I mean, like if you wanted to have different type of feedback mechanism uh, for the person, specifically to the person, yeah, I think content would be a great place to start because that tells you what the person is actually interested in, right? But if you want them to share content to their network or to drive participation and socialization, get their friends to participate, right? Then you want to know who their friends are, right? Who they share with, who they tweet and mention to, right? So if you another same example, right? Using the example of tweeting, right? Then you, instead of looking at the content, what I tweet about, you can say, oh, who do I reply to when I'm tweeting, who do I, then you can start to learn about who are the people that I actually talk to, right? Same data set, analyzed differently, right? One is to focus on the content, what did I talk about? Another one is to focus on the people that I interacted with, right? So this is where, it's really, like I said, there's no, there
A
isn't
single magic logic.
really a one
And
size fits all, right? So, I mean, you really have to you have to understand what you're trying to do, right? What you're trying to do, and then you can ask yourself, what data do I
fantastic.
need to
And
achieve
I
to
think, by the
solve
way,
this
this is
problem?
a fantastic
Yeah,
point. We're out of time. It always goes so quickly, fascinating. Thank you so very much, Michael, for being with us today. Great to have you. For those of you that, and
pleasure, pleasure.
Michael's Twitter handle is there. It's MICH8ELWU, and you can follow Michael on Twitter and find out all about the most interesting topics in big data, in predictive social analytics, and gamification. It's fascinating. Really, really important to follow him. And for those of you that are interested in gamification further, in improving your learning, getting more knowledge, earning a certification, join me this winter as I travel around the world with G Summit Global. You can participate online or live with me and get a certification in person. That's at gsummit.com. And for all of those of you who've been with us today, hope to see you again next week when we'll have another great guest on the gamification revolution. In the meantime, everybody, keep having fun. See y'all.
Thank you.